Live streams are made possible by the generous support of the Sarah B. Folk Charitable Fund.
Hi, everyone. Wow, here we are, Caffe Lena.
Here we are.
I was here in the pre-renovation version, and it's really different now. Can you hear us okay? Yeah? Okay, the way it's going is I'm going to introduce Adam, and then Adam's going to introduce me. First Adam's going to read, and then he's going to introduce me, and then I'll read. And then we thought we would just take a question or two if there's a white-hot need to ask a question. So Adam and I are really good friends, and did we read together in the early years, or have we never read together?
I think we've read once together.
Once,
Yeah.
long ago.
Long ago.
Yeah, so this is for me, a special joy to read with my very close friend, whose work I really admire. So I'm going to introduce Adam. Here's what I was thinking. History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake, Stephen Dedalus says at one point in James Joyce's Ulysses. And in the century that's passed since, many have been the interpretations of that sentence. Adam Braver's fiction, which is often categorized as historical fiction, would seem to map out a very interesting idea of history. From his first book, Mr. Lincoln's Wars, up to his most recent, the very musical and serialist Rejoice the Head of Paul McCartney. History is not a settled matter in Adam's work, as it is for one of Daedalus's antagonists in the passage I've quoted, nor is history a matter tending toward one ultimate theological end, but rather a matter of subjectivities, a matter of phenomenologies, a matter of fragmentations and recombinations. I'm lucky because I've gotten to see a lot of Adam's recent work unfolding, where we find an ever more ambitious eye, an ever more skeptical view of the certainties of history, these tendencies perhaps also binding in his very significant contributions to the literature produced by the Scholars at Risk program, in which history is so often nightmarish, or at least noteworthy for its collision of narratives. The result of this increasing ambition and ferment in Adam's work, as I've said before, is limited by the term historical fiction, unless all fiction, from Nathaniel Hawthorne to Ha Jin to Kazuo Ishiguro to Margaret Atwood, is historical fiction. So here's Adam Braver, not a writer of historical fiction, but a contemporary modernist with a big heart, who has one keen eye, oh, that's my son, on the simulations and artifices of history, who with his understanding of these contingencies promises us something much better, something close to awakening. Adam Braver.
Thank you, Rick. This is, as we sometimes hear at the Institute, the part where I feel like I'm ready to just go home now and sit with that. I'm going to read, as many of you involved with the Writers Institute know, that there is a tradition of reading new work through the Institute. That is usually when we are in our own confine on campus and not in town, but Rick and I decided we would stay with that tradition. So I'm going to read some new work. I'm sort of hesitant to say it is the beginning of a new novel because at this point it would be a novel that's about 45 pages long. But the beginnings of a beginning, something I've been in my head at least calling The Descent. And I will, I'll let it speak for itself, only to say that there are some parts in here where I have X'd out things and to help move it along so it's perhaps a little less stilted in real life than the narrative may come out this way. So, the descent. And I'm starting from page 1, so there's nothing to set up. It hardly surprised anyone when, in his dissent, the Supreme Court justice holding the most extreme position cited his opposition to a 6-3 decision because he, quote, doubts that the White House would even obey an unfavorable order in this ruling, unquote. The case had been one of regulatory jurisdiction, and until the decision came, a matter of bureaucracy whose details did not engage or interest the public. It wasn't his audacity that shocked, nor was it his blatant display of politics and disregard for protocol, honor, and civility. It was the sneaking and underlying truth that the Supreme Court justice holding the most extreme position was right, even if he didn't really care about the potential societal consequences that might resonate from such a statement, mule-headed as he was. Such thoughts had been festering for years on the local level in pockets of the country. National laws were disregarded, ignored, or tabled for local ordinances. But until what came to be known as the dissent, the Washington status quo had kept their systems going, the three branches of the government too blinded and insulated and stubborn to notice that no one cared anymore what they had to say. The statement coming from the Supreme Court justice holding the most extreme position was meant to polarize and dismantle structural norms. His cagey use of the word doubts as a legal cover and as an italicized wink to those waiting for a sign from his corner of the bench. But the intellectually enlightened didn't care about his decision, or frankly, that such a case even was being litigated. What they did come to care about, and what eventually drove the dissent into a confusing national conversation and then a co-opted movement, was the painful admission to thinking people on all sides that he was right, even if he'd merely tripped over his own ideology and stumbled on to such a collectively shared insight. This was the world, spreading across the country, a collection of magnificent and beautiful parts with nothing to hold them together. It was life in the war no one would call a war. And within a week of that statement by the Supreme Court justice holding the most extreme position, Russian ships appeared on the shores of both coasts, a fleet off New York City and one in San Francisco. Poor, handsome Molly, come all the way west from New Orleans to escape the troubles, roving the Texas plains, rambling the high deserts of New Mexico territory, landscapes and vistas she'd never seen before, never even imagined, large and deep and broad. A found dead brother in Plaquemine, a passing salesman selling promise, and a set of lost and angry parents. That's story enough for why. After sidling through the canyons of the Utah Territory, she turned left near Salt Lake City and crossed over the California peaks, the Sierras, where the gold was found and the microchips harvested, and then straight down into the valleys and river towns following the tributaries to the Pacific Ocean and its bay city on the banks. Possibility. It's why she left, made the journey, all that way from New Orleans to San Francisco, a place whose future has no past. There is no better word, possibility. This is your America too, and you also have the right to protect her and to reimagine her. Find her middays on the northwest corner of Mason Street at Post, a stack of broadsides in her hand, funded out of the meager savings she came west with, an account barely maintained by her hourly wage of her pre-dawn cleaning job. It is menial work, nothing she imagined when coming to California. a financial expedient after being deserted by the passing salesman who never came through, heartsick and broken, still walking circles in New Orleans. Each broadside reads peace in big block letters, bold and pronounced, a multitude of ideas in a single word. If she is questioned about what she means by that, Molly answers, peace, as in not war, as in not suffering, peace. It's important that people be aware of how quickly things break down, how once the divisions spread here, as they have in the East, it will become no different than a disease that overtakes the body, spreading fast and with malice until it no longer is a disease, but instead part of the process the body relies on. Here, no one understands and no one seems to care. They, the people of San Francisco, who have little experience with the war no one will call a war, nor interest in its underlying causes, are dismissive of threats. Ignorance is comforting. But, Molly knows, it also is complicity. On Mason Street, broadsides in hand, she will bring up her experiences of insurgent violence, intimidation, the mystery of a brother who ended up dead in the passenger seat of a Ford sedan in Plaquemine. Even if no one wants to hear it, she'll admit the shame of accepting the ease of what one man is willing to do to another. To acknowledge the worst of human nature is essential in order to encourage the best of human nature. But no matter what she says, she's only heard for how she says it. Molly from New Orleans, sized up by the cadence of her voice, greeted by squinting eyes and cocked heads, almost as though she's a foreigner with a foreign tongue, presumed and assumed, each and every time, as if that little regional drawl, a lilt really, is a measuring tape of her aptitude. And she can't snap back, don't judge, can't say that's not what it seems, because then it will appear it is what it seems. She knows what it means when people deny their own intentions. She knows the tone of affronted protestations. She's been on the other side her share of times, presuming and assuming. In general, there is a distrust of her, poor handsome Molly, as though she is not here to be a champion of peace, but instead as an agitator or instigator or opportunist. On his lunch break, one of the office men from a bank building she's been cleaning recognizes her on the street. He is vaguely familiar. Fitted suit over mid-sized shoulders, a long-billed baseball cap embroidered with the company logo, always donned when exiting the building. A trim mustache that edges partway down his mouth, and light eyes trained to convey a persuasive cheer and delight, dismissing seriousness as a loner's strategy. In truth, they all look the same, this brand of men. Their soft feminine hands, the ease in which they move, how they entice through transaction and scheming, always engaged in the same basic conversations: assets, economic growth, investments, shares, and options. They sneer at the problems of anything east of them, instead decamped on the edge of the wide and vast Pacific, a center of capital, of wealth and prosperity. They maintain a century-old prospector's belief in a new vision of progress for the country. Destiny writes ingenuity. And yet how strange that they can't see how such uniform aspirations also underpin the divisions of the war that no one will call a war. The man from the office studies the flyer, holding it away and squinting, crumpling the edge of the paper between his fingers. Peace, he sounds out. Yes, she says, peace. That seems broad, that it could apply to anything. The point. Maybe you mean the problems back east specifically? You say that like it's some other part of the world, she says. They are here too, you know, those problems. Splintering and on the verge. Just walk down to the marina and look at the Russian Navy boats moored beyond the surf. Then ask yourself if you think we're not vulnerable. They are protection, he insists, reciting the common lines that echo down the bank building's hallways, tropes from The Descent that are parroted and repeated from social media and TV talk shows. He says those ships are bringing no disruption, and perhaps just the opposite. They're keeping the supposed troubles from spreading west. Sometimes a problem only exists to those looking for one. Molly counters that their presence does mean the war that no one will call a war has spread west. And furthermore, it's not clear that any engagement coming from the Russians won't turn an American problem into a global problem. Look at their history with Turkey, with Persia. Look at their history with the Sixth Coalition and the 100-Year War. Look at their history with the November Uprising in the partitioned area of Poland, the invasions of Ukraine. And I've barely reached back in time at this point, she adds. I could travel back another 500 years if I kept going, and if you had the time, the point being that the Russian leadership are not altruists. They never act without drive and purpose. This is not about keeping peace. That is why it is up to us to make peace. The man from the bank building starts to reply, but pauses. His lips purse in place, puffed thick like tulips. He says it's too over his head to debate foreign military history. His face flushes, bringing out the blonde in his eyebrows. He shakes his head as if shaking off the whole discussion. Why, he asks, trying to regain control, does she clean offices? He says she clearly is much more intellectually equipped than the average charwoman in their employment. With the economic boom here, he says, there is plenty of other work for someone of your intellect. She looks past him, into the stream of pedestrians puddling around them. Who could support a system premised on making a select few of the rich get even richer on the backs of the suffering? She shakes her head. No, she says, I'd rather scrub floors. He says, not only do you talk funny, but you think funny. She says, I think you continue to miss the point. Molly heads straight back to the boarding house. She's tired, she's worn, tired. If he'd allowed, she would have gone on talking with the bank man into the late afternoon just to forestall a forced return to loneliness. At the boarding house where she stays on Stockton, no one will talk with her. Word quickly had circulated about her street raconteuring after some of the other girls had spotted her on the corner of Mason while going to their various service shifts. They reported that Molly was a live wire, warning that everyone should be careful because even the smallest of polite interactions might incite her. On the walk home, she'd thought about leaving San Francisco, about the pity of believing a traveling salesman who said he could help her find redemption for her brother, and how that pity should be his alone, but instead was hers. She thought about failure, how part of the failure was that she really had nowhere to go. Molly comes out of her room as soon as she goes into it. Stopped in the hallway, hands on hips. Her reddish-brown hair mixes with the wallpaper. My broadsides, she calls out, a foghorn in the dim light. Has anyone seen them? There was a stack on my bed when I left, a whole stack. She is trying to keep calm, not show emotion. They want her to be angry, to explode. It would validate everything they've supposed about her. The landlady fills in her bedroom doorway with an outsized confidence, each palm pushed against the door frame. Fire hazard, she announces. Each word hangs above her as she speaks, like she's crafting a subtitle with her breath. From just a small stack of flyers in my bedroom? It's all wood here, tinder and light, a real fire trap, these old buildings. But everyone has something in her room. Why mine? I don't know what else you want me to say. Fire hazard. The broadside specifically, fire hazard. The landlady turns herself around and closes the door. Molly stands alone, still holding onto her hips, as though keeping her skeleton erect and in place. There is plenty of other work for someone of your intellect. The walls, they are thin. There are thumbtack holes in the wallpaper, rusty water stains trailing from the cornice. The trim, it's chipped and cracked with window frames split at the bottoms. Maybe the landlady does have a point. Still, no one wants to be made to feel wronged. Part of it had been the consequence of being on a drunk, and most of it from a need to believe in something, still gutted by the mystery of what happened to her brother. The passing salesman had talked of safety and of opportunities. He talks of lists, of potential, of possibility, of how to make good for her brother, and maybe even get more clarity or justice, whatever it is you're looking for. The passing salesman knew plenty of people who'd gone west and with them carried dark secrets stolen off the streets of New Orleans. They might be able to help. She bought it all, pushed her drink away and opened her purse then and there. It wasn't as much that she believed in what he was selling, but it was the aside that initially came out as a confession, talking about going west to San Francisco himself and finding the woman he loved, Lola, the naming of which brought her right to life. She, also a frontier entrepreneur, he said, was made of tender heart and steel fists. He'd stopped to swallow and then apologized to Molly, saying that his eyes always watered when he spoke of Lola. He acknowledged they should be focused on matters of business, but such was the pain of love. Returning to his pitch, the passing salesman promised a fresh start once Molly arrived in California, and, as though offering a deliverable, assured her that both he and Lola would be awaiting her with folders of financial and social prospects. But what Molly really paid him for, what sold her, was the idea of a love that can't help but be spoken, so deep it makes your eyes water, as though it could fill the streets, slow and distinct raindrops that one by one could wash away all the filth. The following morning, the banking man from the office building tells her he thought about it. It is cold with a fog that resists burning off. In her hand there are the remaining 3 broadsides, the leftovers she'd come home with last evening. He introduces himself as Kent, and then says he's glad he found her again. Without her phone number, it was as though she disappeared or never existed. Kent says he wants to find her a job, something he actually lost sleep thinking about. She needs to think more highly of herself. This is no life for a woman as bright as her to be scrubbing floors and then standing on street corners with broadsides in her hands. There are smarter ways to make her points than being forever on the outside. The landlady, Molly thinks, she's what makes her feel stupid. He asks, how are your filing skills? It seems in California there are long lines, winding queues of people waiting to make you think you're dumb. The Russian ships remain more a passing curiosity than a mystery. Occasional onlookers still stroll along the marina, glancing out at the bay, noticing how the small fleet sits unmoved for 3 months now. They are like ghost ships, those Russian vessels. None of the onlookers ever report any sign of movement. Initially, a 24-hour webcam had been set up. Grainy and foggy, its footage initially was a sensation until it was clear that nothing discernible was happening, hour upon hour. Soon, the site went black and disappeared. For most people, the flotilla already has become an historic fixture of the bay, no different than Alcatraz. But for select others, such as Molly, there still is a sense of intrusion, unease. Government officials provide no answers, deflecting questions in a way that suggests they know more than they are willing to say about what should be considered an international incident. Most of the time, they come across as being ill-informed and hapless. What strikes people like Molly as most concerning is the lack of urgency, the retreat into the position that if nothing is happening on the ships, then there is nothing to fear. Even in the bank building, where she has become enmeshed and socialized into conforming to a corporate vision of a West Coast unmoored from the rest of the country in its regional dominance, there no longer is talk about the Russian ships. It is boring, old news, a problem that is not really ours. Just like the war, no one will call a war. This is strategic, Molly tells herself, and most insidious, a strategy based on a complete understanding of the modern human psyche. And I'll stop there. Thank you. That was just shy of terrifying to read. I have never met a mind so quick, so thoughtful, and frankly so perceptive as Rick Moody's. When I first started coming to the New York State Summer Writers Institute some 17 or 18 years ago, just being around Rick seemed like a gift. Be it finding myself nearby at the dinner table or at a post-reading reception, and then with time getting to know him a little more intimately in conversational asides, and eventually considering him to be a good friend that now covers so many different interests and aspects of our lives. In terms of his writing, as consistently and brilliant and moving as he is on the page, I would argue that Rick is not someone who merely has a talent for using language as the medium for artfulness, which he does. Instead, I'd propose that, in a sense, Rick is almost constructing a new kind of language, an evolution perhaps.